Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you the greatest threat to Canada's existence as an independent nation didn't come from a secret plot, but from a public suggestion? And what if that suggestion was made by the one person with the power to make it a reality? A specter is haunting Canada, not of communism or foreign invasion in the traditional sense, but of a creeping, insidious threat from its closest ally. The danger does not arrive in the form of tanks crossing the 49th parallel, but in carefully chosen words spoken into microphones, in condescending diplomatic gestures, and in overt political meddling that chips away at the very foundation of Canadian sovereignty. The core of this anxiety was laid bare when Donald Trump, standing before the assembled leadership of the American military, articulated a vision that sent a chilling message northward. And Canada called me a couple of weeks ago. He stated they want to be part of it. To which I said, well, why don't you just join our country? You become 51, become the 51st state, and you get it for free. This was not an off-the-cuff remark at a political rally, nor was it a stray thought released into the digital ether via a late-night tweet. It was a proposition delivered directly to the men and women who command America's formidable war machine, a clear and unambiguous signal that, in the eyes of the presumptive leader of the free world, Canada is not a sovereign partner but a potential acquisition. This statement and the constellation of actions surrounding it has ignited a firestorm of indignation across Canada, an anger born not merely from economic disputes over tariffs, but from the horrifying realization that the nation's independence is being openly questioned and actively undermined. This is the story of a coordinated pressure campaign and why Canadians are, to put it plainly, finished with being treated like America's backyard. The assault on Canadian sovereignty is not a single, isolated event, but a multifaceted campaign of psychological and political pressure, beginning with a calculated war of words designed to humiliate and diminish. The first front in this war is rhetorical. For months, the American executive has casually referred to Canada's Prime Minister not by his title but as governor. This is no mere slip of the tongue. It is a deliberate and venomous downgrading, a piece of linguistic imperialism designed to strip a democratically elected leader of his legitimacy on the world stage. To call a prime minister a governor is to imply that he is not the head of a sovereign state, but a regional administrator presiding over a territory answerable to a higher external power. It is the language of empire, a verbal sleight of hand that reframes an entire nation as a colony. This calculated insult works in concert with the repeated casual suggestions that Canada should simply abandon its nationhood and join the United States. When the 51st state comment is repeated often enough, it ceases to be a joke and becomes a policy proposal, normalizing a concept that should be unthinkable. It creates a narrative framework in which Canada is not a country with its own unique history, culture, and destiny, but a piece of prime real estate that is simply, for the time being, under separate management. In the worldview projected from Washington, Canada, is a project to be completed, a final piece of the continental puzzle waiting to be slotted into place. This rhetorical offensive is amplified and enabled by a second front, diplomatic gaslighting. When a nation is subjected to such profound disrespect, the natural and expected role of a foreign ambassador is to build bridges, to soothe tensions, and to reaffirm mutual respect for sovereignty. Yet, the American ambassador stationed in Ottawa has chosen a starkly different path. Instead of defending the principles of international diplomacy, he has consistently acted as an apologist for the aggressor, dismissing the legitimate outrage of an entire populace as something trivial and irrational. Canadian anger is brushed aside as emotional, a condescending pat on the head to a nation deemed too hysterical to understand the complex machinations of its powerful neighbor. Protests against American overreach are not seen as a valid expression of national will, but are labeled as anti American, a cynical tactic that conflates criticism of a government's policy with hatred for its people. This is a classic gaslighting strategy to twist reality so profoundly that the victim begins to question their own sanity. The message is clear. The problem isn't the existential threat to your country's independence. The problem is your reaction to it. The ambassador is not functioning as a diplomat fostering goodwill, but as a foreign asset tasked with a specific mission to pacify and demoralize the Canadian public, to normalize the empire talk, and to condition Canadians into accepting a subservient role. He is not there to represent his country, he is there to manage a territory. The campaign escalates from words and psychological manipulation to a third, more direct front, overt political interference. The mask of diplomatic subtlety was torn away entirely when a sitting United States Senator from Maine, Joseph Martin, took it upon himself to directly intervene in Canadian domestic affairs. He drafted and sent letters to elected officials in the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, bypassing the federal government entirely. In these letters, he did not merely suggest closer ties or economic cooperation. He urged the leaders of Western Canada to hold referendums with the explicit goal of breaking away from the Canadian Federation to join the United States. He brazenly described Canada's democratic institutions, built over a century and a half, as illusions of freedom, framing annexation not as a hostile takeover, but as a benevolent adoption into a superior system. Let there be no ambiguity. This is recruitment propaganda. This is an act of profound hostility, an attempt by a foreign politician to fracture a sovereign nation from within, to exploit regional tensions for the purpose of territorial expansion. It is a flagrant violation of every conceivable diplomatic norm. The fact that a U.S. senator felt so emboldened, so confident that he could commit this act to paper and mail it across an international border without fear of serious reprisal speaks volumes. It reveals that this annexation fantasy is no longer confined to the fringes of political thought. It is spreading, metastasizing within the American political establishment. This is not the action of one rogue official. It is a symptom of a much deeper and more dangerous political disease. Layered on top of this psychological and political warfare is the blunt instrument of economic coercion, the fourth and perhaps most potent front in this campaign. Trade policy, once a matter of negotiation and mutual interest, has been weaponized. The carefully constructed framework of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement has been repeatedly undermined by unilateral tariffs and protectionist Buy American breaches, all aimed squarely at crippling Canadian exports. The strategy is one of economic blackmail, a gangster-esque approach to international relations where threats are no longer veiled. The message has been made painfully, explicitly clear. If Canada refuses to play ball, If it refuses to bend to American will, its economy will be systematically dismantled until it does. This is not trade policy, it is coercion. It is a deliberate effort to leverage Canada's economic dependence on the U.S. market as a weapon to achieve political ends. If they cannot own us outright through persuasion or political meddling, the strategy is to strangle our economy until we are left with no choice but to collapse into their arms. This reveals the full cynical playbook. First, humiliate the nation with demeaning words and insults. Second, weaken it with tariffs and economic blockades that create unemployment and instability. And third, once the country is sufficiently battered and demoralized, step in and present annexation as the only viable rescue. This is not policy, it is a premeditated strategic assault on the economic viability of the Canadian state designed to make sovereignty an unaffordable luxury. When you step back from the individual incidents, the insults, the ambassador's dismissals, the senator's letters, the tariffs, and view them as a whole, the full picture comes into terrifying focus. This is not a series of unfortunate misunderstandings or diplomatic gaffes. It is a coordinated environment of pressure, a multi-pronged offensive designed to soften Canada for annexation. Trump declares the intention in front of his generals. His ambassador in Ottawa cheers it on while insulting anyone who dares to object. A state senator puts the plan in writing and mails it to our provincial leaders. And all the while, the threat of economic ruin hangs over our heads like a baseball bat in the hands of a mob enforcer. The great irony, and the source of so much Canadian fury, is that this aggression comes from a nation that is visibly rotting from the inside. America, the nation lecturing Canada on freedom and prosperity, is an empire in steep decline. Its infrastructure is crumbling, its bridges and roads in a state of disrepair. Its healthcare system is a predatory construct that bankrupts families for the crime of getting sick. Its political discourse has descended into a toxic, poisoned state of perpetual civil strife, where violence has become an accepted, almost foundational element of public life. As America slides ever deeper into authoritarianism, flirting openly with outright fascism, it has the audacity to look north at a stable, functioning democracy and see it as a solution to its self-inflicted wounds. Collapsing empires do not look inward for healing, they look outward for scapegoats, for distractions, and for resources to plunder. They see our vast reserves of fresh water, our oil, our sprawling farmland, and our strategic Arctic routes, not as the sovereign wealth of a neighboring country, but as a continental backup plan, a collection of assets to be seized to delay their own inevitable decay. This predatory gaze from a declining empire is particularly jarring because it represents a fundamental rupture in the long-standing narrative of Canada-US relations. For over a century, the relationship has been publicly celebrated under the banner of the world's longest undefended border, a symbol of peace and mutual trust. Generations of Canadians were raised on the comforting myth of a special relationship, casting the United States as a benevolent, if occasionally boisterous, older sibling. There were disagreements, certainly, over issues like acid rain, softwood lumber, or cultural exports, but these were largely seen as family squabbles, manageable within a framework of shared values and assumed goodwill. The current posture from Washington shatters this illusion entirely. The language is no longer that of a partner, but of a predator. The dynamic has shifted from one of asymmetrical friendship to one of existential threat, forcing Canadians to reevaluate a foundational pillar of their foreign policy and national identity. The psychological toll of this shift cannot be overstated. Canadian identity has, in many ways, been forged in quiet opposition to the American monolith. We are the nation that is not America. This has often been a subtle, nuanced distinction defined by our public health care, our stricter gun laws, and our commitment to multiculturalism. But when the threat becomes this overt, the defense of that identity must become more explicit and more robust. The casual nature of the annexation talk is a profound psychological blow. It suggests that our entire national project, our history, and our distinct societal choices are insignificant and ultimately erasable. It reinforces the classic mouse and the elephant analogy, where the elephant's every twitch is a potential life or death event for the mouse. The United States can inflict devastating economic damage on Canada with a single executive order or a targeted tariff, while suffering minimal blowback itself. This immense power imbalance is what transforms arrogant rhetoric into a terrifyingly credible threat. We have no reciprocal leverage, no equivalent economic weapon to wield in our own defense, leaving diplomacy and a desperate search for other allies as our only recourse. Furthermore, this external pressure acts as a potent acid on Canada's internal cohesion, threatening to dissolve the bonds that hold our vast and regionally diverse country together. The American strategy, as evidenced by the senator from Maine's letters, is not just to intimidate the nation as a whole, but to actively exploit its pre-existing fault lines. It seeks to amplify the voices of Western alienation, to whisper promises of prosperity to regions that feel disconnected from the political center in Ottawa, and to turn Canadian against Canadian. This makes the threat deeply insidious. It is a two-front war, one against the external aggressor and another against the internal divisions that this aggression deliberately inflames. The ultimate goal of such a strategy is to weaken the federal state to the point of collapse, making it easier to pick off the pieces one by one. The attack is not just on our border, but on the very idea of a united Canada, transforming a political challenge into a battle for the nation's soul. Confronted with such a clear and present danger, Canada cannot afford the luxury of complacency. Shrugging this off as Trump being Trump is a fatal miscalculation. A serious and robust national plan is not just prudent, it is essential for our survival as an independent nation. The good news is that this work has already begun. Canada is moving with increasing speed to diversify its trade relationships, forging new and strengthening existing partnerships with economic blocs in Europe, Asia, and the global South. The goal is to systematically wean ourselves off the economic dependency that has made us so vulnerable. But this is a monumental task. Untangling a trade relationship that has been the bedrock of our economy for nearly 40 years, going all the way back to the original NAFTA agreement in 1988, cannot happen overnight. For decades, the United States has been our single largest market, a reality that has brought immense prosperity, but has also left our neck in an economic noose. It is this very vulnerability that is now being so ruthlessly exploited. If we remain serious about this diversification, if we continue to build stronger, more resilient ties with other nations around the world, then we can envision a future, perhaps not so distant, where an American president can no longer yank our chain and threaten our economic stability at will. That is the true meaning of independence in the 21st century. and it is a goal we must pursue with unwavering resolve. So, this is where we stand. The leader of the United States has openly suggested our annexation in front of his military command. His ambassador in our capital gaslights us, calling our righteous anger anti-American. A senator from a neighboring state has actively encouraged the dismemberment of our country. And underpinning all of it are the constant looming threats of tariffs, blockades, and economic ruin. These are not jokes. These are not hypotheticals. These are threats and actions, part of a calculated strategy designed to soften the Canadian people for the eventual loss of their country. And we are angry. We are profoundly, justifiably pissed off. Because while America collapses under the weight of its own dysfunction, descending into an authoritarian nightmare, it believes it has the right to drag us down with it. But here is the fundamental truth. We have a choice. We cannot stop a foreign leader from running his mouth. We cannot stop a rogue senator from writing letters, but we can stop feeding the beast. The resistance does not begin in the halls of Parliament or in the chambers of the United Nations. It begins in the simplest and most accessible of places, the grocery store. It begins with a conscious, deliberate act of economic patriotism. Every time you are standing in an aisle, every time you pick up an apple, a box of crackers, a bottle of wine, or a jug of juice, you have a choice. Look at the label, find the country of origin, and when you see that it was made in the United States, remember the insults, remember the threats, remember that they said out loud and in public that they want to own us. And then put it back on the shelf and choose a Canadian product instead. This is the first step. This is how we begin to reclaim our independence, not with anger and shouts, but with quiet, resolute purpose, one shopping cart at a time.